In the early, uncertain years of World War II, the skies over Europe and the Pacific were evolving into lethal arenas. Fighters and bombers became the sharpened tools of war, and nations raced against time and ingenuity to develop the aircraft that would give them a decisive edge. Among the designs born from this crucible, none would come to symbolize aerial supremacy quite like the North American P-51 Mustang. But the P-51 didn't begin as a symbol of dominance. Its story starts in the summer of 1940, not in the United States, but in Britain, where the Royal Air Force was desperate. After the fall of France, the Luftwaffe loomed as a seemingly unstoppable force. The RAF, though holding the line during the Battle of Britain, needed new fighters and fast. The Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk was one of the aircraft they turned to, but it lacked performance at high altitude, so the British sought new suppliers. Enter North American Aviation. Led by the bold and visionary Dutch Kindleberger, the company proposed something daring. Instead of merely producing the P-40 under license, they offered to design an entirely new fighter from scratch in record time. The British agreed, with the understanding that time was critical. North American's engineers, under the direction of James Dutch Kindleberger and chief designer Edgar Schmude, set to work. What followed was a remarkable feat of engineering speed and precision. In just 117 days, from the signing of the contract to the first flight of the prototype NA-73X on October 26, 1940, North American had crafted the skeleton of what would become a world beater. Its sleek, laminar flow wing design, developed with help from the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics (NACA), promised better performance and reduced drag. The prototype featured an Allison V1710 engine, a liquid-cooled V12 that performed well at low altitudes, but lacked the high-altitude punch that the British badly needed. Still, the RAF was intrigued enough to place an initial order. When the first Mustangs were delivered to the British in 1941, they were impressed with its low-altitude speed and range. Designated as the Mustang Mk1, it was put to work in reconnaissance and ground attack missions, though it couldn't match the Spitfire in a dogfight at 25,000 feet. It was faster and better armed than many of its contemporaries at low altitude. For a while, the Mustang remained an auxiliary player in the Allied arsenal. American interest was tepid at first. The U.S. Army Air Forces preferred the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt and the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. But cracks were starting to show. Over Germany, U.S. bomber losses were mounting. The B-17 Flying Fortress and B-24 Liberator, while formidable, were being cut down in staggering numbers during daylight raids. Escort fighters like the P-47 lacked the range to accompany bombers deep into Germany. The breakthrough came almost by accident. British engineers had the idea to fit the Mustang with the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the same power plant used in the Spitfire. The result was nothing short of transformational. The marriage of the Merlin engine to the Mustang airframe produced a machine that could climb, dive, and fight at altitude and do so for over 1,500 miles on internal fuel and drop tanks. The first production version of the Merlin-powered Mustang, the P-51B or Mustang Mk3 in British service, was a revelation. It could escort bombers to Berlin and back, engage German fighters on equal or better terms, and return home with fuel to spare. The Mustang wasn't just fast, it was rugged, elegant, and deadly. The U.S. Army Air Forces took notice, so did the 8th Air Force in England, where long-range escort capability was desperately needed. In late 1943, the first P-51BS arrived in European theater of operations, with squadrons like the 354th Fighter Group. These early Mustangs began changing the air war in ways no one could have anticipated. By the winter of 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force faced a grim dilemma. Daylight bombing raids deep into Nazi-occupied Europe had proven both essential and catastrophic. Despite their heavy armament and tight formations, the B-17s and B-24s were being savaged by waves of German fighters. Loss rates often exceeded 10% per mission, unsustainable even for America's industrial might. The need for a long-range escort fighter had shifted from urgent to desperate. The arrival of the Merlin-powered P-51 Mustang offered a game-changing solution. Early deployments of the P-51B and P-51C began with the 354th Fighter Group, a 9th Air Force unit reassigned to bomber escort duty in late 1943. These Mustangs immediately stood out. With drop tanks attached, the aircraft could reach nearly every bomber target in Germany and still engage enemy aircraft. On the return flight, their presence over Berlin Leipzig, and Schweinfurt shocked the Luftwaffe. German fighter pilots had grown used to attacking American bombers with impunity after the escorts turned back, but now P-51s were arriving over the target areas, sometimes even before the bombers. The Luftwaffe suddenly faced an enemy that could outfly them, outgun them, and didn't have to leave the bombers unguarded. The airspace that had once been their hunting ground was now a battlefield. Mustang pilots quickly adapted to the new style of warfare. One of the most effective tactics developed was the fighter sweep. P-51s would race ahead of bomber formations to clear out German fighters before they even reached the bombers. In other cases, they would fly tight formations with the heavy bombers, breaking off only when enemy aircraft approached. Among the most famous Mustang units was the 357th Fighter Group, based in Leiston, England. This group included a young pilot named Clarence Bud Anderson and a future ace named Chuck Yeager. These men, and many like them, used the Mustang's speed and agility to deadly effect. They pioneered aggressive air combat tactics that leveraged the P-51's high-altitude performance and diving speed to gain the upper hand. Meanwhile, the 332nd Fighter Group, better known as the Tuskegee Airmen, proved themselves with Mustang squadrons over Europe, flying in their distinct red-tailed P-51s. They earned a reputation for discipline, skill, and reliability. Bomber crews began to request the Red Tails by name, knowing their escort would not abandon them. One of the key turning points in the European Air War came in early 1944. Armed with the P-51, the 8th Air Force launched a series of massive raids deep into the heart of Germany, known as Big Week, February 20th to 25th, 1944. The goal was to cripple the Luftwaffe's fighter production and destroy its pilot corps. Day after day, P-51s escorted thousands of bombers over key industrial targets. While the Americans suffered losses, the Luftwaffe was battered. Dozens of experienced German aces were lost in dogfights with Mustang pilots. For the first time, the tide in the air was turning. The results were dramatic. In March and April 1944, the number of bomber losses fell even as the intensity of the raids increased. The P-51s were doing their job escorting bombers deep into the Reich and neutralizing the fighter threat. German aircraft production continued, but the Luftwaffe could not replace its lost pilots fast enough. The skies over Germany were no longer a one-sided battlefield. In addition to escorting bombers, the Mustang took on a wide variety of roles. P-51 strafed airfields, destroyed locomotives, disrupted supply lines, and hunted German aircraft wherever they were found. The Mustang's long range allowed pilots to loiter over targets, pursue retreating enemies, and carry out missions previously impossible for other fighters. Its impact was not limited to Europe. In 1945, P-51Ds began appearing in the Pacific theater, though the distances were greater. The Mustang's range again proved decisive, escorting B-29 Superfortress bombers on missions from Iwo Jima to Japan. P-51s defended the bombers from Japanese interceptors and participated in ground attacks on airfields, ships, and industrial centers. Over the home islands of Japan, the Mustang once again became a feared predator. Back in Europe, the P-51D variant had become the definitive model, with a bubble canopy providing full 360-degree visibility, 6.50 caliber machine guns, and reinforced airframe. The P-51D was the version most pilots would fly during the final year of the war. Its balance of firepower, speed, range, and agility made it one of the most effective piston engine fighters of the war. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, Mustangs had shot down over 950 enemy aircraft in the European theater alone. They were the tip of the spear, breaking the Luftwaffe and giving the Allies full control of the skies. As the war in Europe moved toward its end in early 1945, a different kind of battle was intensifying across the vast, scattered islands of the Pacific. While the Mustang had gained its fame over Europe, the U.S. military began to recognize its potential as a long-range escort fighter in the Pacific as well. The threat of Japanese interceptors and the immense distances involved in bombing missions over Japan made the P-51's presence all the more necessary. Unlike the European front, where Allied bases in England were relatively close to targets, bombing Japan required missions of extraordinary length. B-29 superfortresses operated primarily from bases in the Mariana Islands, Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, or later, closer islands like Iwo Jima. Early raids on Japan often went unescorted because no existing fighter could make the round trip that changed with the introduction of the P-51D Mustang to the Pacific Theater in early 1945. From captured airfields on Iwo Jima, P-51s began flying long-range escort missions to Japan, some stretching over 1,500 miles. Flying from the volcanic runways of Iwo, they accompanied B-29s on bombing raids over Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, and other heavily defended cities. This new capability allowed the American bomber force to hit strategic targets in Japan with increased confidence, though the threat from Japanese fighters was not as intense as the Luftwaffe had been in 1943. Japan still fielded formidable defenses. The P-51 proved once again to be the right aircraft at the right time. Its high speed and maneuverability allowed it to engage Japanese fighters, most notably the Mitsubishi A6M0 on equal or superior terms. While the Zero was still highly agile, it lacked the armor and speed to compete with the Mustang, especially at high altitude. Mustang pilots, trained in the techniques of energy fighting, often used their aircraft's superior speed and dive performance to counter Japan's more nimble but fragile interceptors. One of the most dramatic examples of the Mustang's role in the Pacific came during missions over Tokyo. These were some of the longest fighter-escorted bombing missions of the war. Mustangs flying from Iwo Jima would rendezvous with B-9s en route to Japan, protect them through intense anti-aircraft fire, and fight off any Japanese aircraft attempting interception. The sight of P-51s flying over the Japanese mainland was a psychological blow to the Japanese population and military. Air superiority, once an unquestioned advantage for Japan early in the war, had now fully shifted to the Allies. But the Mustang was more than an escort fighter, it was also a hunter. In their ground attack role, P-51s in the Pacific became known for devastating fighter sweeps across the Japanese countryside. They strafed enemy airfields, railroads, truck convoys, and industrial zones with .50 caliber gunfire. Pilots often returned with gun cameras full of destroyed planes on the ground and columns of burning targets. In particular, they focused on the destruction of Japan's already strained transportation and supply networks. As the war neared its final months, the Mustang's reach extended even further. Some squadrons began experimenting with napalm, bombs, and rockets, adding a new layer of lethality to the aircraft. In low-level attacks against Japanese air bases and shipping convoys, P-51s often flew in waves, tearing through targets with precision and firepower that left little room for recovery. The Mustang was also used in photo reconnaissance variants. During this time, modified to carry cameras instead of guns, these unarmed Mustangs flew at high speed and high altitude to capture intelligence on Japanese troop movements, infrastructure, and city layouts in preparation for potential invasions. Their speed made them difficult to intercept, and their imagery was crucial for Allied planners. Despite the relentless bombing campaign and the devastating results of air power, including the eventual use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Mustang's role in the final stages of the war was unquestionable. It flew alongside history in its most decisive moments, escorting aircraft that would forever change warfare and geopolitics. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the Mustang had already solidified its legacy in two of the largest theaters of war. It had helped break the Luftwaffe's back and brought American firepower to the heart of the Japanese Empire. It had fought from the green fields of England to the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, from the skies over Berlin to the shattered cities of Japan. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world began to reshape itself. Nations disarmed, alliances shifted, and peace, however fragile, settled across war-ravaged continents. For many of the machines that had helped win the war, it was the end of the line. Bombers were scrapped, tanks were abandoned, and countless fighters were mothballed. But not the P-51 Mustang. Despite being a piston-engine aircraft at the dawn of the jet age, the Mustang was far too capable and far too valuable to simply be retired. Its exceptional performance, range, and rugged construction made it ideal for continued service, both in the U.S. military and with dozens of air forces around the world. In many ways, the P-51 found a second life after World War II, one marked by new missions, new conflicts, and a broader global presence. In the immediate post-war years, the United States retained hundreds of P-51Ds in active service. The newly created U.S. Air Force separated from the U.S. Army in 1947, assigned Mustangs to Air National Guard units and used them as trainers, reconnaissance platforms, and even interceptors in locations where jet aircraft had yet to fully take over. But the Mustang wouldn't just sit in hangars or fly ceremonial patrols. It would soon return to combat. In 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea, sparking the Korean War, a brutal, grinding conflict that would test the resolve of the United Nations and pit U.S. and South Korean forces against Chinese and Soviet-backed communist troops. At the start of the war, jet fighters like the F-80 Shooting Star and the newly arriving F-86 Sabre were still relatively few in number and limited by short range. The need for close air support and flexible ground attack aircraft quickly brought the P-51 Mustang back into the spotlight. Now designated the F-51 by the U.S. Air Force, the Mustang was rearmed and deployed to the Korean Peninsula. It became the backbone of the U.S. Tactical Fighter Force in the early stages of the war, operating from primitive forward airstrips, delivering ordnance on enemy supply lines, columns, and troop concentrations. The Mustang's durability, long range, and heavy armament made it a natural choice for the rugged terrain and rough conditions of the Korean theater. Pilots flew low-level attack runs through mountain passes, dodging enemy fire while delivering bombs, rockets, and strafing attacks. They operated in all weather, often with minimal ground support, and in the face of increasingly dangerous anti-aircraft defenses. However, the Korean War also marked a turning point in aerial warfare. The jet age had arrived in force. Soviet-supplied MiG-15s appeared in the skies over North Korea, challenging American air supremacy. The Mustang, for all its strengths, was no match for them, making a dogfight. As a result, F-51s were eventually withdrawn from frontline air-to-air roles and reassigned to lower-altitude support missions, while newer jet aircraft took over the skies. By 1953, most Mustangs had been phased out of U.S. combat roles, replaced by jet-powered aircraft more suited to the demands of modern warfare. But the Mustang's role in Korea had been vital. It had bought time. It had held the line when nothing else could. Yet even as it disappeared from American combat squadrons, the Mustang was just beginning a new chapter on the world stage. After World War II, the United States and Britain sold or gifted hundreds of surplus P-51s to allies and friendly nations. These aircraft became the foundation for air forces across Europe, Asia, South America, and the Middle East. Countries such as Sweden, Israel, Italy, the Dominican Republic, Indonesia, and Australia all operated Mustangs, some well into the 1960s. In Latin America, Mustangs served in several air forces, including those of El Salvador, Guatemala, and Bolivia. In some cases, they were used for internal defense and counterinsurgency operations. In others, they flew in regional skirmishes. The Mustang's ability to fly from rough airfields and deliver precision firepower made it a valuable asset in environments where infrastructure was limited and threats unpredictable. One of the Mustang's most notable post-war combat roles came in the Middle East. During the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, the nascent Israeli Air Force acquired a small number of P-51s through complex and often secretive means. These Mustangs were quickly put into service, flying attack missions against enemy forces and helping secure air superiority. Later, in the 1956 Suez Crisis, Israeli Mustangs flew daring low-level missions, attacking Egyptian airfields and convoys. Elsewhere, Mustangs clashed in border disputes and civil conflicts. In the Dominican Republic, the aircraft saw action during political upheavals. In Indonesia, Mustangs operated during independence struggles and regional conflicts. The aircraft had become a global warrior, versatile, powerful, and relatively inexpensive to maintain. As the 1960s arrived, the sun slowly began to set on the Mustang's military career. Newer, faster, jet-powered aircraft rendered the P-51 obsolete in high-threat environments. Spare parts became harder to find, airframes aged. The Mustang was finally retired from frontline service in most nations by the mid-1960s. Yet, in some regions, it lingered even longer, testament to its enduring design and mechanical reliability. For American pilots, the P-51 Mustang remained a symbol of excellence, even as they transitioned to aircraft like the F-86 Sabre, the F-100 Super Sabre, and the mighty F-4 Phantom. Many veterans recalled the Mustang with reverence. It had carried them through the toughest missions, saved lives, and earned respect from friend and foe alike. As the final Mustangs were retired from military service around the world in the 1960s and early 1970s, It might have been expected that the story of the P-51 would come to a quiet end. Instead, the aircraft found new life not as a tool of war, but as an icon of peace, remembrance, and passion. In the post-war years, thousands of surplus P-51s had been sold off as scrap or relegated to dusty storage yards. Yet even as the jet age soared forward, a growing number of aviators, collectors, and warbird enthusiasts recognized that the P-51 was no ordinary relic. It was a masterpiece of engineering and design. It was history with wings. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, restoration efforts began to gather momentum. Veterans who had flown the Mustang during World War II and Korea began seeking to preserve the aircraft not just as museum pieces, but as flying testaments to a pivotal time in history. Civilian-owned P-51s started appearing at air shows, lovingly restored to pristine condition, with polished aluminum skin gleaming in the sun and the deep growl of the Rolls-Royce Merlin roaring once more. In North America and Europe, air shows became the stage for the Mustang's rebirth. The unmistakable silhouette of the P-51 long nose, bubble canopy, and signature laminar flow wings became a centerpiece of flying tributes to the greatest generation. Audiences thrilled to the sight of Mustangs tearing through the sky in formation, recreating dogfights, or performing aerobatic poses. For many who watched, it was a direct and emotional connection to the past. One of the Mustang's greatest strengths in civilian life was its versatility. Though originally built for combat, the aircraft proved highly adaptable to civilian aviation. Restored Mustangs were often fitted with modern avionics, radios, and safety modifications. Some were painted in authentic wartime liveries, while others sported custom schemes. Air racers modified Mustangs to push performance limits, with some achieving record-breaking speeds in competitions like the Reno Air Races. But for many owners, flying a P-51 wasn't about speed, it was about stewardship. The aircraft had become flying museums, each one a tangible reminder of the sacrifices made in skies over Europe, the Pacific, Korea, and beyond. Pilots who flew these aircraft spoke of a bond, a living link with the men who had once faced death. Behind the same stick and throttle, museums across the world added P-51s to their collections, both as static displays and as flight-worthy aircraft. Institutions such as the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum, the Imperial War Museum in Britain, and the Plains of Fame Air Museum in California preserved Mustangs with meticulous care. These museums not only displayed the aircraft, but told the stories of the pilots who flew them, the missions they undertook, and the world they helped shape. Even Hollywood played a part in preserving the Mustang's legend. The aircraft appeared in countless films and documentaries, helping new generations visualize and understand the nature of aerial warfare in World War II. Movies like Empire of the Sun, Memphis Belle, and Red Tails featured P-51s in stunning aerial sequences, while documentaries captured the personal accounts of Mustang aces and ground crews. Technological advances also aided the preservation movement. With the rise of computer modeling, 3D scanning, and precision machining, parts that had once been impossible to replace were now being fabricated with incredible accuracy. Aircraft restorers in the US, New Zealand, and Europe began building complete airframes, sometimes from original blueprints or wreckage recovered from forgotten crash sites. Even more remarkably, new-build P-51s emerged. Companies such as Cavalier Aircraft Corporation in the post-war years, and later organizations like Stallion 51 and Pacific Fighters, began producing replicas and modified versions of the Mustang for civilian customers. Some were full-scale. Others, like the Titan E-51, were scaled-down homebuilt kits for private pilots. By the early 2000s, the P-51 Mustang had become not just a warbird, but a cultural symbol, perhaps the most beloved fighter aircraft of all time. Veterans who had once flown them in combat now sat in the back seats of two-place trainers, reliving their past with wide smiles and misty eyes. Aviation lovers, historians, and young enthusiasts continue to be drawn to the Mustang's aura. In many air shows and memorial flyovers, a P-51 leads the formation. When the familiar whine of the Merlin engine echoes overhead, heads turn, and silence often follows. To some, it represents power; to others, freedom; but to all, it represents a story that should never be forgotten. The P-51 Mustang's legacy is not only measured in dogfights won or enemies downed. It is measured in how it continues to fly, not just through the air, but through history, memory, and inspiration. Every rivet, every oil stain, every weathered control panel tells a story of youth and courage, of speed and survival, of engineering brilliance born from necessity. Today, over 200 P-51 Mustangs remain airworthy worldwide, a testament to their design and to the dedication of those who have preserved them. They fly not in anger, but in honor. They are the thunder of history made real. And as long as skies remain open and memory remains alive, the Mustang will continue to fly forever. The fighter that helped turn the tide of war and became, perhaps, the most admired aircraft ever to take wing.